more time to get situated. So around 5 minutes, we'll be starting. Thank you.
Did you start the live stream yet? Okay. Oh, yeah, there we go. Cool. So, I love this. All right, that's great.
I found it never worked, so you can see more detail. That's fun. There's area myself, the rest I love your job. I said, this is where you're stuck with that problem. I call it. Yeah. Wait.
You too.
Hello? Hi, everyone. We're about to get started. If you want to find your seat. All right, so I'm going to give a bit of an introduction here. Welcome to the Mojave Desert Land Trust headquarters. My name is Sarah Bliss, and I am the Director of Land Conservation for the Mojave Desert Land Trust. In July of 2023, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act was passed into legislation by Governor Newsom. Because of its recent passage and high importance to the community, our organization felt it was important to provide a venue to share information with local and regional residents and interested parties who may have questions about this new legislation. We have a packed agenda and audience today, so I wanted to go over some safety information before we began. So if you take a look around, if you're in person, we have a couple of emergency exits. One over there by the camera, one over to my left, and then right where you came in, we have some double doors there. If there's any questions, we do have some staff around the venue. If any staff can kind of wave their hands so people know where you are. Perfect. And then it's also important for make sure that you're all hydrated. Right behind you there, we have a variety of waters, teas, and a couple snacks. So we got a wave over there. If anyone wants to get any food or drink, feel free to grab some back there. We do have some restrooms. Our ADA restrooms are over to the back through those doors. And then we also have some additional ones behind the building if there's a long wait. And just to let you know, this presentation is going to be live streamed today on our YouTube channel. So just to let you know that. So I would also like to welcome some special guests today. We have the Joshua Tree National Park Superintendent, Jane Rogers, here today. We have Michael Curry, a field representative for Assembly member Greg Wallace, Assembly District 47. Thank you. And I want to give a few moments to do a land acknowledgement. So our organization acknowledges that we are on the traditional landscape of the Serrano, Chemehuevi, Cahuilla, and Mojave people. We acknowledge that the land we're headquarters on is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Marayam, commonly referred to as the Serrano people. We honor their presence and recognize their contributions since time immemorial as the first stewards of this land. We recognize that Native Americans continue to practice traditional lifeways on their sacred ancestral lands throughout the California desert. We would like to acknowledge all the indigenous peoples who have preceded us in preserving the natural scenic, and cultural resources of these lands. The Mojave Desert Land Trust is actively working to go beyond land acknowledgement, focusing on sustained and meaningful engagement with tribal communities today. In regards to the Western Joshua Tree Act, we're also interested in learning about the co-management principles in the plan and to learn more information from governmental leaders. We're interested in seeing what steps the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will take to include tribal engagement. The Mojave Desert Land Trust has actively supported the California Endangered Species Act listing and the drafting of legislation to protect the Western Joshua Tree. As an organization managing thousands of acres of Western Joshua Tree, we are acutely aware of the threats to the species and the need for preservation. We intend to be closely involved in the Act's conservation measures, including the creation of a conservation plan and data collection for long-term effectiveness monitoring of the Act. Our goal in hosting this event today was to offer a space for community discussion. So we're all glad that you're able to make it here today. And also for our viewers online, we're glad that you've joined us as well. Today we have gathered an esteemed panel of speakers that include Brendan Cummings with the Center for Biological Diversity, Todd Esque with the US Geological Survey, Western Ecological Research Center, and Kaiser from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Each of our speakers are going to have a short presentation, and we're going to be saving the Q&A for the last session. So please keep all your questions at that time. If we don't have time to get to your questions today during that time, I think some people are going to stay on a little longer, or you can also reach on our website or some of their website for more information. So our first speaker today is going to be Brendan Cummings. Brendan Cummings is the Conservation Director of the Center for Biological Diversity, a nonprofit organization focused on protecting endangered species. As an attorney, Brendan has litigated dozens of cases to protect our wildlife and public lands. Brendan is the author of the legal and scientific petition seeking protection of the Western Joshua Tree under the California Endangered Species Act. Today, he will talk about the Western Joshua Tree Act and how we got here. So, please come up, Brendan.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thanks MDLT for hosting this event. And really thanks to everyone for attending. And a last thanks for those of you who participated over the last 4 years in the efforts to get Western Joshua trees protected. It's been quite a journey. In previous talks I've done here or virtually or in front of the Fish and Game Commission, I've tried to explain the threats facing Joshua trees and make the case that they qualify for protection under the California Endangered Species Act. I won't do that tonight, partly because many of you have heard that before, but also because that battle has essentially already been won. With the passage of the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act, the state explicitly recognized the threats facing Joshua trees and the need for extra protection, as well as the fact that previous management at the local level was inadequate. So that debate's over. Now we can debate the merits of the law, how it should be implemented, and we'll get to some of that later. But the threshold question of should they be protected is behind us. It's been answered with a yes. So I'm going to attempt to briefly recount the convoluted legal and political process of how the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act came to be. Drew will talk about its actual content, the permitting schemes, and Todd about the science and what recovery will look like. And we'll answer all questions at the end. To briefly summarize, the threats to Western Joshua trees fall into 3 broad categories: climate change, fire, which is related to climate change but also fueled by invasive grasses, and development. Tonight, I'm going to mostly focus on the last of these, not because development is the most important threat, but because it is the most straightforward one to address. It's also the most politically contentious, and it's also the main focus of the new law. Now, the state of California has estimated that 30% of western Joshua tree habitat has already been lost or degraded to development. About half the range of the tree in California is on private lands, and a federal study from a few years ago projected that virtually all currently unprotected private land in the West Mojave and Antelope Valley will be developed for housing in the coming decades. So if you only consider habitat loss from development, Joshua trees certainly are a significant conservation concern. But when you add fire and climate change, which have already arrived all too soon, then they're very clearly imperiled. Based on all this, in October 2019, I petitioned the California Fish and Game Commission to protect the western Joshua tree under CISA. The petition is about a 75-page document that summarizes the science and the law. It's on our website if you want to do a deep dive into the threats facing the Joshua tree and how CISA works. But importantly, unlike the federal government, which recognized climate change as a threat when it protected polar bears under the federal ESA 15 years ago, California has never listed a species under CISA where the primary threat is climate change. Now, CISA listing is a multi-step process bouncing back and forth between the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the California Fish and Game Commission. The department implements and enforces CISA, including permit issuance, and makes recommendations to the commission as to whether a species qualifies for listing, while the commission makes the actual decision. There are two main votes under CISA, an initial one that gives it interim protection as a candidate species, and a final one that determines whether to protect it more permanently or not. The first important date is October 9, 2020, when the Joshua tree officially became a candidate species, giving it interim protections. At that point, it became illegal for anyone in California to kill or move a western Joshua tree without a state permit. As many of you will recall, that vote was highly contentious, was delayed several times to work out interim permitting processes for solar projects, Yucca Valley sewer projects, backyard trees, and various other similar things. But ultimately, the commission voted unanimously to protect the species as a candidate, kicking off a year-long status review by the department. Now, because the science is clear, I think so, and California is seen as a leader on climate, protecting Joshua trees under CISA shouldn't have been controversial. But importantly, unlike the federal ESA, CISA prohibits take, the killing or removal, without permits, of plants. And in contrast to virtually every other state-listed plant, which are narrow-range endemics, occurring in only a few acres or a few hundred acres, Joshua trees still occur over millions of acres, with many thousands of private parcels of land. And private lands in the Mojave are among the last cheap and easily developable wildlands in the state. So there was a lot of opposition from those who would profit after the conversion of Joshua tree habitat to something else. And it's important to note, even if it doesn't always feel that way up here, but politically, California is functionally a single-party blue state. So all effective opposition to environmental protection is framed in progressive rhetoric. Our opponents were the utilities and solar companies who would pave the desert with solar panels to reduce our emissions, which is necessary to address the climate crisis. Developers purporting to build affordable housing to address the homeless crisis, the housing crisis in California, and various labor and trade associations seeking good-paying jobs in the high desert building those projects. And all these constituencies are very well connected in Sacramento. So what happened? In April 2022, the department issued its status review, concluding that the species was not threatened. The department's status review went through external peer review, and importantly, 4 of the 5 peer reviewers, the ones who actually studied Joshua trees, disagreed in whole or in part with the department. The 5th who agreed with the department was a professor that was recommended by San Bernardino County to be a peer reviewer and had not studied Joshua trees. The status review has lots of problems, and I won't go into them all, or many of them at all, but among the things it did, it stated that fire impacts are only temporary, when we know that recovery could take centuries in a normal climate, which we no longer have, and is highly unlikely in the face of climate change. The review also stated that, quote, changes in the range of Western Joshua trees that are ultimately caused by climate change will likely occur very slowly, perhaps over thousands of years. Remember, that statement's from the Newsom administration. This reflects a profound misunderstanding of climate change and how fast impacts are being felt. We obviously don't have 1,000 years to protect Joshua trees. Summer maximum temperatures that will preclude recruitment will be here in 2 or 3 decades under the most optimistic scenarios, and in about a decade under current emissions trajectories. So in sum, you can interpret the status review as either produced by a department that had no real understanding of the magnitude and speed of climate change, or one that knew the impacts but didn't like, or was directed not to accept, the implications of listing. I'm not sure which is worse. At that point, we realized the Joshua tree had become, in essence, an inconvenient species. It stood in the way of too many things. That takes us to the June hearing last year. In the run-up to the hearing, the overwhelming majority of written comments supported listing, with the majority of opposition being form letters from real estate agents. Over 200 people, including many familiar faces here, participated in the hearing either in person or online, with about 80% speaking in favor of protection. Now, the commission is usually 5 members, but because of a retirement, there were only 4 commissioners at the time of the vote. Short version of a multi-hour drama that stretched over 2 days is that there was a 2-2 tie, meaning the species remained protected as a candidate, but did not gain permanent protection as a threatened species. They scheduled another vote for October, by which time, presumptively, the tie-breaking commissioner would be appointed by the governor. And now, one of the key things here is the 2 no votes. If you watch the videos of the deliberations, they did not appear to really disagree with the fact that Joshua trees are threatened, but instead were most concerned about the impacts of listing on big solar and other developers, and whether CISA was the right tool for the job. They sought delay of the vote, ultimately justifying it due to purported lack of tribal consultation. Now, the issue of appropriate tribal consultation is an important one, but I believe that the commissioners who invoked it as a reason to delay the vote were less interested in the actual input than as an excuse for delay. As one commissioner who voted yes noted, every testifying person or organization that identified themselves as Native American at the hearing spoke in favor of listing. So why did the commissioners seek delay, the 2 of them? They were pretty explicit that they wanted more time for some sort of compromise to be worked out, either via the legislature or through development they were calling a conservation plan, which could potentially serve as a substitute to CISA listing. So October then rolls around, and right before the hearing, like literally 2 days before, Newsom appointed his former legislative liaison to be the 5th commissioner. The new commissioner stated that he needed more time to come up to speed on the voluminous record, therefore needed delay for the delay, but based on what he knew, he didn't think he would vote for it to list. So if you're doing a vote count, we lose 3-2. All the commissioners said they hoped there would be a legislative solution. They rescheduled the vote till February. The night before the February commission hearing, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act was released by the administration as a proposed budget trailer bill. At the hearing itself, the 5th commissioner retracted his statement that he was a likely no vote and said after reading more, he was not so sure. In essence, his October statement was directed at me, saying I better work out a legislative deal or I risk losing entirely. And in February, he telegraphed essentially the same message to the solar industry and other opponents of listing so they wouldn't try to kill the bill either. We'd created a situation where even though there was not a clear majority of commissioners willing to vote to list the Joshua tree, there was a consensus among them that a no vote, resulting in a complete loss of state protection, and protection going back to San Bernardino County, Kern County, Yucca Valley, and other local jurisdictions, was politically untenable. And absent a vote, interim protections continued. So we had a fair bit of political leverage at this situation, and a lot of uncertainty. So how the bill got drafted and amended and the ups and downs in the legislative process earlier this year is a very convoluted saga. At many points, it looked like the bill would die, either because of its actual contents or because it was caught in a crossfire in essentially a turf battle between the governor and the legislature, whether it should be a trail budget bill or a policy bill and various things of that sort. And I really don't have the time to tell all those stories today, although many of them are quite interesting and it was a surreal experience. But at the end of the day, we actually ended up with legislation that I'm quite happy with, and partly surprised by that, given the whole journey to get there. It provides protections equal to, and in some cases, better than under CISA. And since it is law, not regulation, these protections are permanent and litigation-proof. It also has more transparency, with lots of reviews and reports and public processes, and requires a conservation plan by the end of next year. Looking at it in comparison to all other federal and state regulation of imperiled species, I believe it really provides the most comprehensive oversight scheme for the management of imperiled species of anywhere in law that I'm aware of. So in that sense, it's a really pretty groundbreaking. Another key point is that unlike traditional endangered species mitigation, like even when you're listed under CISA or the federal ESA, you can still get a take permit to kill or remove or harass or harm the species. So that's there regardless of whether it's CISA or the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. But traditionally under CISA, most mitigation is done project by project. And that can result in a hodgepodge of protected mitigation land scattered about, sometimes actually owned and managed by for-profit mitigation banks. So it's sort of a flawed system, but it's the system we have under CISA. Here, the funds will be pooled with the goal of large-scale landscape-level projects. You know, people are starting to talk, maybe we should have a new state park in the West Mojave, in the Antelope Valley, using those funds, do something really large-scale for the species. So that all sounds good. What's the trade-off? There's a big trade-off, and I don't want to minimize it. It's a permitting scheme that is faster and in many cases cheaper for developers to get. As the department fact sheet notes, and I agree with them on the facts of this, in the 2.5 years of interim protection, the department received an order of magnitude more inquiries regarding Joshua trees than for all the other 300 or so CISA listed species combined. It really is a unique species in terms of the management and permitting challenges it presents for the department. Now, Drew is going to give some of the actual details of the bill and how the permits work. But if I had to sum it up in a few sentences, the Western Joshua tree remains protected as a Canada under CISA for the foreseeable future. But in addition to the permitting options available under CISA, there is a new permitting process also available where people can pay fees for the removal or killing of a tree. Those fees are set rather low, lower than I would like, but the bill requires a process where they will be adjusted, which means increased, by the end of 2026. So in essence, the political deal that got us the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act is the tree gets permanent protection and a conservation plan by a date certain. CISA listed species conservation plans and recovery plans are discretionary. We want them, but they're not required to happen and they rarely happen. Here we get an actual plan by a deadline. Developers get certainty for 3.5 years that the permit costs will be something that they can live with. And we all get certainty as to what the rules are, rather than likely years of litigation and consequent uncertainty that would have occurred regardless of which way the commission voted. If they had voted to list, industry would have sued to overturn it. If they had voted against listing, I would have sued to try to maintain protections. All that uncertainty is gone. We have the law is the law. We have a planned deadline that we were going to work on collectively going forward. So again, given the political reality that I don't think, given the circumstances of the Joshua tree and the industries and other activities that its protection impacts and who would impact it by the activities they want to do, and the current commission we have, the current governor we have, the current politics in California, I don't think votes were there to get it protected under CISA. So in that context, I think the bill is actually a great outcome for the species, particularly since in 3 years' time, we can get the fees raised enough so that they'll be very similar to what we would have gotten under CEQA, which will fund more mitigation projects, the kind of things that MDLT does so well. So I'll pause there. It's, that's sort of the backward looking, how we got to the bill. And I truly do feel quite good about the bill, notwithstanding the fees are lower than I like. The other two speakers are mostly going to be forward looking, how the bill works, how permits apply, what kind of recovery and science actions go forward. And then I'm happy to take any questions you have through the course of the evening. And it's about 105 degrees at the podium.
All right, speaking about the ups and downs, this will be a little bit of this between all our guests here. But thank you, Brendan. And I know that our leadership in here at MDLT, we've made statements about how this is a step in, the right direction. And, we're definitely interested in learning more from our other speakers today. So our next speaker is going to be Todd Esque, who is a research ecologist with the US Geological Survey, the Western Ecological Research Center, working from the middle of the Mojave Desert in Boulder City, Nevada. Todd's research focuses on the resilience of desert plants and animals to persist in the face of disturbances such as fire, invasive species, climate change, and development. He has been studying the life history and ecology of Joshua trees across the Mojave Desert since the Joshua Tree National Park fire in 1999. He will be going into the science behind conserving the Joshua tree, what we still need to do and know. So Todd, will you please come up?
You guys hear me in the back? No? How about that? Okay. Like you said, right up there. Okay. So we'll juggle that and making the slides go forward. So I wanted to talk to you today about some of the science that goes behind understanding the recovery of Joshua trees for this meeting with the Mojave Desert Land Trust. Yeah, I can do that. I can do that. Just hold them over here. That works. Sure. Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. That's more comfortable for me. So I want to acknowledge a lot of the groups I work with. Joshua Tree Genome Project, the Biological Working Group for Joshua Trees. There's a lot of agency and public people that got together to try to understand what do we need to know to understand Joshua trees better? The Mojave Cultural and Research Center locally, the Mojave Desert Land Trust, US Fish and Wildlife Service. I think I added some of the other ones to the wrong talk that I was giving. So other people at the National Park Service staff, Bureau of Land Management staff, and the Department of Defense staff have all shared ideas about Joshua trees. And I agreed to come and give this talk this evening with Kelly Hermanson, with the stipulation that we sort of didn't represent just my work, but sort of what is the community thinking about? What do we need to know about Joshua trees in order to make sure we do good conservation? So I kind of went through a thought process, and the process is what's important, not exactly the terms that I use. So I'll correct it where I have learned since that I was wrong. When you have endangered species listing, it sort of acknowledges that there are risks and threats to a species that cast doubt on their continued existence, unless there are changes made. So, for example, in some places we might need to do more intensive management to be able to protect some areas where Joshua trees are doing okay. And so that's sort of the listing part of an endangered species. And then the endangered species status usually is understanding the endangered species status is aided by making a plan for the recovery of the species or a conservation plan. So a recovery plan, conservation plan, doesn't matter, but you need to get together and figure out what are we going to do that'll make a difference for for this species if we're gonna, if they're in trouble. And so then recovery planning involves understanding the status of the population, whether they're decreasing or they're stable or they're increasing. You have to make measurements to know that. And so across the whole range of the Joshua trees, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And it has to be for multiple self-sustaining populations, so groups of Joshua trees in multiple places. Because if you just protect one group, then there's a chance that mega drought will happen or a big fire, and you might lose them. So you want to have multiple ones, so there's redundancy in their population. And then for a period of time, you want to make sure that there's self-sustaining populations for an established period of time that's relevant to the species. So one thing that strikes me about the contrast between Brendan's talk and mine is that all that he described happened fairly recently, relatively recently. We've already been studying Joshua trees. I've been studying for 20 years. People have been studying for more like 100 years. And that's just one generation of Joshua trees, really. 50 to 70, maybe 100 years, depending on where you are in the desert. So things are not that fast for Joshua trees. We'll show you more about that as we move forward. So the recovery status is most useful if we know enough about the species to have some certainty about our conclusions. That's where the science comes in, and multiple people may work on the same question and try different runs at it to make sure the hypotheses are being tested thoroughly to know if we have a stable population or an increasing population or it's decreasing. So recovery actions and recovery status can be informed by monitoring and research. And that's what I'm going to show you about today. So I came up with 5 things I thought we needed to know in order to understand the recovery of Joshua trees, assuming that they're in some trouble, which I think can be agreed on. Where are the Joshua trees right now? Where are all the Joshua trees at? So we have a good handle on what's going on with them. How many Joshua trees are there out there? How are our Joshua trees doing? What is the health status of the populations? So in other words, are they increasing or decreasing? And are the individuals healthy or not? Where might Joshua trees be in the future? And finally, what about the Joshua tree moths? Let's not forget about that. We'll spend a little time talking about that right at the end. So I only have about 15 slides today, so this will go pretty fast. A couple of slides on each one of those topics. First of all, where are Joshua trees now? So it's a very widespread species. They bound the Mojave Desert on 3 sides. So even beyond the edges of the Mojave Desert, all the way over by Congress Junction, Arizona, in the east. Just down here, a little bit south of here, and then along the eastern edge of the Sierras, up into the mountains a little bit. Sometimes they occur in really remote places that are difficult to access. And so we tried to figure out a way that we could check on where the Joshua trees were remotely. And so it turns out that adult Joshua trees are really conspicuous on the landscape, and we can see them out there from kilometers away. And we can also see them in remote sensing, like this picture here of Mojave Desert Land Trust headquarters. So the adult trees are really easy to see. The little trees, not so much. And down there in the bottom picture is the arrow points to a juvenile Joshua tree. It's about knee high underneath a juniper. So with remote sensing, you never see those. And those are the ones we worry about when we talk about Joshua trees, because up until they're about as tall as us, they usually don't breed. They can breed at about, they can flower at about 1 meter, but usually not till about 2 meters. And that's 50 to 70 years. So just to get to the point where they can flower for the first time. So that's why we're interested in those little ones, but that's kind of a side note. So I just wanted to show you here with this other picture that there's the Joshua trees around the outside of Mojave Desert Land Trust. Really easy to see from Google Earth. Everybody has it on their computer these days. And it was one there that I had a question about. And that's kind of how our process worked. We did this remotely, and we made dots of where they are and where they aren't. And for every quarter of a kilometer, so 500 meters on a side, we went across the desert and made note of where they were. And this is the result of that work. This was my team's COVID project. So we searched 672,000 1/4 meter cell grids in Google Earth. And so whenever somebody said, I don't have anything to do, that's what they got to do. They got another line of 500 cells across the desert, and they got to say yes, no, yes, no. We try to keep it at about 40 seconds per cell, and you can do the math on that. Then we went out and drove around to make sure that we were accurate. And we validated 29,000 cells out on the desert by driving around with binoculars and a rangefinder and determining, yes, for sure they're there. And then we went back to our map and double checked to make sure it was accurate. And that ended up, we drove 15,000 kilometers doing that. And so this map shows you, this is just sort of the logistics of the whole thing. On the left side, left of this line, are the western Joshua trees. And on this side are the eastern Joshua trees. At 1/4 kilometer, everywhere we can find them. And I'll stand by the map. I'll just say that. There's an area up here where the imagery was not good. And we couldn't rely on it, in fact. And so that part is not, this is actually a model which has some additional information, but we'll go back to the empirical yes-no stuff at the end of the talk. This area up here had fuzzy mapping, and it turns out it's the most important area for Joshua trees if you want to understand the eastern and the western, because right about here, they hybridize. So it's biologists all excited when you got two species that hybridize, and that's the hybrid zone. But because we don't have good imagery and it's really hard to gain access, this is a bombing range right in here. So it's pretty difficult to get in there, even though I've been in most of those kind of places in the desert. I haven't been in there. We don't have any samples from in there to tell us which Joshua trees are which out there. So we can tell genetically, not only just looking at them, but we can tell genetically which are which. The only other place that has question about that is this dot here up by Newberry Springs. And we don't have any genetic samples for that little patch we found. I think it may be one square where we had Joshua trees out in the middle of nowhere out there. Otherwise, it's really well defined. And gotta keep it rolling. I wanted to get to the point about not just the logistics of it, but what does this mean? What does this tell us about Joshua trees in this mapping? So one of the things that stood out to me, so we have this here is the blue is very close to truth about where are there Joshua trees and where are not Joshua trees. The yellow is where they could be, but they are not there right now, as far as we can tell. And so they call that the potential niche versus the actual distribution. So the blue is where they actually are, and you can go out there right now and find a Joshua tree anywhere that it's blue on here. But the yellow, you will not find a Joshua tree, but our information that we understand says they could be there. And so if you look at the eastern Joshua tree, they nearly fill their niche. I mean, they have a little ring of area where they could be outside, and it turns out they're really fairly, they're continuous across these areas. There are not a lot of blanks in the middle of them. Big patches of populations that are dotted across the desert. In contrast, if we look at the western Joshua tree, they're a lot more spread out across the landscape, and they're somewhat continuous in line, but within them they have less continuity. So, for example, in the West Mojave out in here, it looks like somebody nibbled at them. They're missing where it's white. There's missing Joshua trees, and I think that's what Brendan was somewhat talking about. When we talk about the western Joshua tree, we're losing them. Those seem to be, they're square areas, so they seem to be areas that we've lost Joshua trees, in some cases to development, in some cases to fire, and in some cases, like some of these big yellow patches, like up in here, probably just not suitable at this time for them. It can be deep history as well. It could have been something that happened a long time ago, maybe back thousands of years to the Pleistocene, the late Pleistocene, where wiped out the Joshua trees in that area, and they haven't moved back in yet. Because it turns out Joshua trees don't move very fast. And in fact, they're among plants, they're sedentary. So these guys have these edges, and we don't see strays where there's ones getting away, seeds being moved long distance and then establishing. We don't see that. I was really interested to know. It's very rare for that to happen. These are some of the things we can learn from this kind of work. The next thing we want to know is how many Joshua trees are there. So there's lots of ways we do that. We make estimates mostly, because counting every Joshua tree, that's even beyond my group. So, but what we can do is make these plots. And this is just an example. We found out that like 50 meters on a side, about as far as you can throw a rock. Turns out you can use a square, you can use a circle, you can use lines across the desert and then go to points on the line and go to the nearest Joshua tree. All these different ways can give us a density of how many Joshua trees per given area that you have. If you add those all up across an area like, say, the Mojave National Preserve or Joshua Tree National Park has a parallel group of plots like this, and even some more than that, where they've counted the Joshua trees in a small area and then extrapolated to say, what's the density of the Joshua trees there? That's one way to do it. But even having 5 national parks that we've done that at, the rest of the desert is wide open. and we don't have those estimates. And so we don't have a very good estimate of how many Joshua trees out there and how they're doing. And so there's another way we try to get at this. And that's using remote sensing. So by remote sensing with satellites, there's something called LiDAR. It uses laser points that spreads down billions of laser points at different places, and it can tell how high things are off the ground. And it turns out since Joshua trees are taller than most everything else around, you can identify the Joshua trees using that. If you use that along with some spectral analysis of the reflectance of the light off the landscape and some ground truthing, we have one of my colleagues, Kevin Buffington, made this map for recent fires at the Dome Fire from a couple of years ago and the York Fire that happened this month. And was able to estimate how many Joshua trees we lost. And so the Dome Fire, turns out we lost 800,000 Joshua trees in the Dome Fire based on this estimate, which was 80% good. So that's, again, how accurate is it? Well, it's at least 80% accurate. And that's, among modelers, you're pretty happy if you get above 80. Get above 90, you get really happy. You get to 1, you don't believe it. So what this shows on this map is the light color. I made these bigger so you can see them. The light color shows 1 Joshua tree per hectare in these areas. And the really deep purple are more than 100 per hectare. So that shows you the density of the Joshua trees for this area. There isn't LiDAR for the whole desert right now, or at least we don't have access to it. So if you had it for the whole desert, you could estimate how many Joshua trees are out there. The next thing we're working on is how many branches do they have? And we're still working on that. So the next question is, how are they doing? We use those same plots that I just described to you already. In this case, I just pared it down to a square one with a few Joshua trees in there. And the green circles are supposed to be Joshua trees, and the clear circles are bigger shrubs that hide the little Joshua trees to illustrate that. And so it turns out these white spots on this map illustrate the 50 to 75 plots like that we have at Mojave National Preserve to look at how are Joshua trees doing out there. And it turns out how many there are. Greater than 50% of the plots had greater than 100 Joshua trees per hectare in that area. So that's pretty high density, except for the places now that have burned, which was unfortunate. Also from those plots, we saw how many were in each plot. If you take those and average them, this is Mojave National Preserve data. And on the left, the bars are Joshua trees that are tiny to about 200 millimeters. So just that tall. Those are the smallest ones, and they go up to almost 8 meters up here. And there's very few of those. So this is a snapshot of the whole population at the national park of what do the Joshua trees look like. And it shows you there's a peak of the really little ones, which is what you want to see. That's the recruitment. And the next group in that bar in the middle are the ones that are pre-reproductive also. So they're up to 2 meters tall. We're considering them non-reproductive. So they're still not contributing to the growth of the population. And then the ones out here in the last group are the ones that are contributing to the population. And you can see as they get older, we get fewer of them, just like humans. And when we look at human populations, it's just the same way. And Joshua trees they live a lot longer than us, but they kind of have a parallel life history. This is a seedling Joshua tree. A lot of times we hear about seedling Joshua trees. That's actually a seedling Joshua tree. It's just the monocot. It's just like that. So it's not these ones that are this tall. These are about 10 years old when they're that big. And this is a deteriorating Joshua tree. And those all get counted on those plots that we illustrated. This map is sort of that, if you put a line on the last one, along the top of it, oops. If I were to put an outline on the tops of the Joshua trees and make a single line out of it like that, this next one shows the 5 national parks that have Joshua trees. It shows their profile in a snapshot from about 2007 when we first did this work. And it shows you that, and this is the order, can you guys see that in the back? Death Valley, Mojave National Preserve, Grand Canyon Parashant, Joshua Tree National Park, and Lake Mead. This sort of shows you the high peaks. Death Valley has lots of little Joshua trees, and then drops down, middle slope, and then tapering off, like we said. In contrast, at the other end of the scale, Lake Mead almost has no bump of the little ones, showing very little recruitment. That's not something we want to see, and that doesn't show a growing population. or potential for growth. Because again, that's to get to be reproductive is 50 to 70 years. And so if we don't see any little ones out there now, that means we got a ways to go before we'll see any out there at all. And that's the way we interpret this type of work. So how are Joshua Trees doing? Looks like not as well in Lake Mead as at Death Valley and the other parts, because the rest of them have somewhat of a bump showing the recruitment. This is my newest map, and this is to show you for the refuges of where do we think in the future Joshua Trees will be. So we're kind of just getting the tip of the iceberg with all these slides because a lot of work goes into these. The first one is the modern, everyone's heard about the different climate projections. Is it going to be, sometimes we refer to it as the Prius model, is if everybody drove Priuses or electric cars, and then if everybody drove Humvees, this would be that model. And so it's with the, how hot is it going to get under those conditions, for one thing. There are also development models that go with that as well. But this shows you the hatch marks are where Joshua Trees are right now. So for example, up in the northeast Mojave Desert for the eastern Joshua Tree, the hash marks show where they are right now. The yellow shows, in this case, in 2040, how much they'll shrink back if things go the way we think they're going to go. And the red shows in from 2040 to 2070, how much they'll shrink back. And that's what will be then the future refuge for Joshua Trees, the place that the climate will meet Joshua Tree needs for all their life history requirements of pollination and flowering and germination and then growth are only going to be met in much smaller areas if it works the way we think it's going to work. That's a whole lot of models stacked on each other. And so we're all at a point where we should be skeptical about these things, but at least it can give us insight into what might be and what might we do about those kind of things. The kind of ways we use this would be to say, for Joshua Tree National Park, we've talked with Jane about we're going to have to be much more intensive management in our refuge areas, for example, of not letting the fires get away from us out there if we can help it. That's a pretty tall order, but that's the only thing we can possibly do if under these kind of circumstances. This is the more of a moderate conditions. There's not a lot of differences, but this is where people get in and dig in and zoom in on these and look at in a lot of detail and what the differences are between these different scenarios, the climate scenarios, and in different future time steps. So this is what we've done to take a look at where Joshua Trees might be in the future, where the refuges might be, and what we can do about it, thinking about what we can do about it. And the last thing we wanted to look at was, what about the Joshua Tree moths? So the thing is that it's really important to not forget about the moth, because we've said that the Joshua Trees would be self-sustaining, these populations. These are the places, if they're recovered, then they're going to be in self-sustaining populations that are either stable or growing. But they don't make it on their own. They got to have the moth. So we should really be paying attention to what's going on with these moths. And we know way less about the moths than we do about the Joshua Trees. So this is just to pique your interest in this and to highlight for some of the folks that are involved in the conservation and management that we also need to be studying what's going on with the moths. The conservation actions need to consider that it's an obligate yucca moth. So for example, when we have a fire, if the larvae or the pupae of the moth are in the top 2 centimeters of soil, just like most of the annual seeds that are out there for the wildflowers, the heat from that fire will likely scorch them. And what happens then? How far can the moths fly? Can they repopulate these burned areas? We don't know anything about that stuff. So these are the things that I want to not miss as we move forward on this type of questions. So to sum it up, our community now has a range-wide understanding of where Joshua Trees are. And it's a brand new model. You should be skeptical of it. And if you see there are Joshua Trees in places that I didn't think they were, or you don't think they are where I did think they were, I'd really like to hear about it. It becomes an obsessive thing, I have to admit, when you start making maps like that. You want it to be as good as it can be, but they're never perfect. We're developing the tools to know how many Joshua Trees there are, and understanding that at least 50 plus years of recruitment will require on-the-ground work. The last 50 years of recruitment will require on-the-ground work. So Joshua Trees that are this tall can't be seen from remote sensing. So we're still going to have to get out there and walk around. There's still work for people that want to hike around in the desert to understand Joshua Trees. Demographic research illustrates how populations are doing as climate and land use practices change, but more information is required across the range of both species. So we're just getting to the beginning of understanding that. And we now have hypotheses about the future of Joshua Tree distributions, and how their refugia will be affected, and where the management activities need to be in the future. So again, it's just to start the discussion. And we need more ecological research about yucca moths to understand Joshua Tree population persistence. So thank you.
Thank you, and those were some amazing maps. And so our next guest is going to be Drew Kaiser, who is a senior environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. He was hired in June of 2023 to be the technical lead for the planning and implementation of the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. Today, we will learn a bit more about the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act implementation, which includes permitting, the Conservation Fund, and Conservation Plan.
Just giving the presentation. God, he's a well-dressed man, that guy. We didn't plan this. Sure.
Joshua Geeks Unite.
Can everyone hear me? Okay? Back. We turn it up maybe a little bit.
Okay,
Turn it up a little bit. Hello, testing. How's this? Better? Kinda? Okay. All right. Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Drew Kaiser, and as Sarah mentioned, I was hired in June of 2023 to be the lead and implementer for the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. Before that, I was a botanist with Mojave National Preserve, and I've worked with Todd and then Brendan for a while. And I'm excited to be still working with Joshua trees, but on a larger scale. So. All right, so just some highlights of the Western Joshua Tree Act. I think Brendan kind of hit on a lot of these already, but it provides a CISA-like protections for Western Joshua trees. And then it creates two permitting systems, one for the take of hazard trees and how to manage those, and then also for incidental take for projects and kind of management of trees that aren't. Hello, testing. A little bit better. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Third thing that it does is it creates this Western Joshua Tree Conservation Fund, and the fees that go from the incidental take permits, they go into the fund. And the purpose of the fund is for doing land acquisitions and doing conservation projects in Western Joshua Tree habitat. The third thing that it does is it requires CDFW to come up with a conservation plan by 2024. This is kind of one of the main reasons why I was brought in, coming from a conservation background to kind of come up with and help kind of guide this plan as we go forward. And then just one more note that it also requires the Fish and Game Commission to reconsider the listing in 2023, no matter kind of what outcomes are so far. So, all right, and so I'm just going to talk about those three things kind of in the middle, and it's mostly kind of about permits because that's kind of what we have most flushed out right now. I am going to touch on the conservation fund, some activities, and then also the conservation plan. So the purpose of these hazard management permits is to remove or trim dead trees or limbs. Also, you can do trimming of live trees, and so just note here that it does not cover the removal of live trees. And then we're going to go over some of these definitions here on the next slide. So the conditions, so each one of these, every permit has to meet at least one of these conditions. It either has to be fallen over and is within 30 feet of a structure. And then, or it could be leaning against a structure, or it is creating an imminent threat to public health and safety. So we kind of have one picture here on the top where a Joshua Tree branch is fallen over, it's leaning up against a telephone pole, that's definitely an imminent threat to public health and safety. And then the bottom picture is a Joshua Tree limb that is leaning on a tree. Sorry, I should go back. So dead trees and limbs also require an attestation from the property owner or a certification from a designated plant specialist that they are in fact dead. And I'll go over the conditions of what is a dead tree next. And then another thing to note is that only a designated plant specialist can trim a live Joshua tree. All right, so here we have some definitions, and these are from the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. They define dead basically as, it doesn't have any green leaves and it hasn't burned, or it could be fallen over and completely detached from the roots, or it's fallen so that the roots are no longer kind of embedded in the soil. And so, so the important thing to note is that, you could have a Joshua tree that has burned and it might not have any green leaves on it, but Joshua trees can resprout after burns. And so it does require kind of this 18-month period after it burns in order for you to fully say that it's not coming back. We have a definition of structure in the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. And that's not only limited to a residence, but it could be like an ADU, it could be an existing residence, garage, carport, swimming pool, patio, greenhouse, storage shed, and so on. So basically, the tree has to be within 30 feet of one of these things, or else it does not qualify for a hazard management permit. So if you have like a Joshua tree, it's in a field somewhere, and there's nothing really kind of around it, the hazard management permits would not apply. All right, and then the third kind of definition that we have here in the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act, it kind of introduces this as a designated plant specialist. And so it defines a designated plant specialist as someone who is certified by the International Society of Arboriculture as an arborist. Or it could be an individual with at least 5 years of professional experience relocating or restoring California native vegetation. All right. So the process. So I'm sure that many of you, were affected by Hurricane Hillary. We got an influx of permits kind of right after that, and so you might be kind of wondering what I do with my Joshua tree that is either fallen over and is now creating kind of a hazard. We do have these hazard management permits, and they are ready right now. So you can go to our website. There's a little QR code here, but it's probably too small for people to scan, but that'll take you to our permit application. So on the permit application, we need a few things. We need the contact information, the place where the hazard tree is located, either an address or an APN. We need a photo that's attached to the permit, and then we either need like the attestation or certification if you're claiming that it's a dead tree. So once you have kind of all of that information in there, you'll send that to one of our inboxes. It's WJT hazard permits at wildlife.ca.gov. So you send all that information there. And then once you get approved, you get your permit back, then you can go through the removal process. And so a property owner can remove a detached tree or limb from their place, but if it is attached, then it has to be, so if it's like, a dead limb or, like a hazardous live limb, it has to be removed by one of the designated plant specialists. All right, and then you're gonna have 60 days in order to complete this, and then we require that the permittee submit a completion report 30 days after the action. All right. So now we're going to go into the other permitting system that is created by the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. Brendan kind of alluded to these. But first, I did want to kind of talk about the other kind of permits that are associated with Western Joshua trees that are also available at this time. So not only do we have the hazard management permits and the ACT ITPs, but the California Endangered Species Act incidental take permits are also valid since it is still a candidate species under CISA. And then there's a few other kind of like miscellaneous permits that you can obtain in relation to Joshua trees, or safe harbor agreements, or memorandums of understanding. And so those kind of come into play when you're doing either like scientific research or restoration. You can apply for these MOU permits. All right, but I'm just going to talk about the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act incidental take permits. So in order for us to issue one of these permits, the incidental take permits, the permittee must meet certain conditions. The first of which is that a census has to be submitted with the application. And then the census is going to take information on all Joshua trees within the project site. And then the information that's required is kind of the size class of it. So the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act calls out 3 different size classes: less than 1 meter, 1 meter or greater, but less than 5 meters, and then 5 meters or greater. And then we also need photographs of each tree in the census. All of this is required in the act. And then, so I don't know if you can see, but we are currently developing census instructions to kind of help people make maps and take data. And then one of the things that we're working on is a form in Survey 123. And so if any of you all came out to the Dome Fire planting, you might be familiar with this. We use this to kind of capture data for the plantings that we were doing out there. But it's a free app, and then we have a little QR code. You just scan the QR code once you download the app. It basically pulls up the information that we need. You can collect the location information in there, size classes and photos, and you can submit those all through the cloud. So you actually don't have to like attach an email and rename the file, but you can do that if you want. We have instructions on how to make a map in Google Earth. So those will all be released pretty soon. We plan on releasing the instructions for the census before we actually release the applications for the ITPs. And then one last thing that you should know is that so each Western Joshua tree stem or trunk that arises from the ground is considered an individual tree regardless of its proximity to other trees. So just keep that in mind when you're out there doing their censuses. Right. Other conditions, the permittee must avoid and minimize impacts to and the taking of Western Joshua tree to the maximum extent possible or practical. And so some of we're developing these avoidance and minimization measures, and they're going to be kind of released in the application for the ITP, and they're kind of going to be based on a project by project basis. And so, if you have like kind of a simple project that might only be removing or relocating a few trees, you probably won't have as many of these measures as if it was, maybe a large project over many acres, removing or relocating a lot of trees. So these are going to be determined on a case-by-case basis, but they can include things like seed collection, not trenching during storms to avoid erosion around Joshua trees, integrated pest management plans, and limiting herbicide and insecticide use, because we know that the moths are really important, so we want to take care of those moths as well. All right, and then the third kind of condition is that it's in the act that we can require that a permittee relocate a Joshua tree. So right now we're developing guidelines and protocols for doing this, and they're due before the conservation plan. But we're looking into like safe harbor agreements and kind of establishing like places that want them, if that is one option. And then the guidance and protocols, they have to be consulted with designated plant specialists or people who have been doing relocation and restoration for a while. And so Jane and Jay and Nick over at Joshua Tree would probably be tapping you all to kind of help us develop these protocols. So kind of like the last condition in the act that it says for incidental take permits is the permitting must mitigate all impacts to the taking of Western Joshua Tree. And so as Brendan mentioned, kind of the thing that's a little bit different about the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act from CISA is that the permittee will just pay specified fines in lieu of conducting the mitigation activities. And so those fees are going to go into the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Fund, whose purpose is to acquire, conserve, and manage Western Joshua Tree conservation lands, and completing other activities for Western Joshua trees. All right. So one thing that the Western Joshua Tree also kind of calls out is a difference in fee schedules. And so if many of you all are local here, they won't, this language won't necessarily apply, but it calls out kind of like a reduced fee area that is this blue polygon right here in the middle. And so there's kind of, that area, which doesn't include Joshua Tree or Yucca Valley or Continental Palms. And then there's kind of like the regular kind of fee rate. And I know that you all can't see that because it's pretty tiny on here, but this map is online. It's on our website. And so you can go in and it's an interactive map. You kind of zoom in, zoom out, and see exactly where you are. All right. So something that might apply to you all down here to get that reduced fee rate is that the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act authorizes CDFW to enter into agreements with cities and counties to delegate limited authority to take to issue hazard management permits and incidental take permits. So the conditions in there are a little restricted. It's up to 10 trees for single-family, multifamily residences, single-family and multifamily residences, or accessory structures, or up to 40 for public works projects. But CDFW has to concur with all the avoidance and minimization conditions that are in the permit if it's over 20 trees, but less than 40. And so right now we are talking with local cities and counties. We had a webinar just recently kind of explaining some ins and outs of the permitting agreements. So we hope to be establishing those pretty soon. And then all permits that are obtained through these delegation agreements with the local cities and counties, they would actually, they would qualify for the reduced fee rate. But there are some limitations to that, like proximity to Joshua Tree National Park. So there's more information on that on the website as well. So. All right. The conservation fund. So yeah, all those incidental take permit fees, they go into the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Fund, which was created by the Act. So the purpose, as I mentioned, is acquiring, conserving, and managing Western Joshua Tree lands and completing other activities to conserve Western Joshua trees. So it's not just limited to land acquisition or conservation easements. And I'll explain what some of those other activities are. So those mitigation fees go into the fund, but also the fund is able to receive other support. And so things like donations, and one thing that I'm pretty excited about is that we applied for a application to get a special interest license plate. And so if you all have seen, the ones for Yosemite or Tahoe, we are actually in the process of getting one for the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. And then the fees from those will go into the fund and then help conserve. So you can drive around and look cool with your Joshua Tree license plate and be helping at the same time. So excited about that. All right, and so some of the uses of the fund, mainly for addressing threats to Western Joshua Tree. It calls these things out in the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act. The land acquisitions, establishing conservation agreements, things like monitoring, restoration, and then endowments for land that is conserved. And so we hope to be working with Todd and this biological working group to kind of maybe help with some of the monitoring of Joshua trees and see how they're doing. And so we're going to be the Conservation Fund calls for CDFW to prioritize land acquisitions and restoration projects. And I'm excited to say that we actually have a prioritization assessment ready to go. And then one more thing about the Conservation Fund is that it says that CDFW can retain one or more consultants to assist in locating, acquiring, conserving, managing conservation lands and other mitigation activities. And so you might be hearing something about this in the near future. Stay tuned. All right, so that was the Conservation Fund. The Conservation Plan, all right, is the purpose of it is, we're going to be developing and implementing this conservation plan in collaboration with Fish and Game Commission, governmental agencies, so local, state, federal agencies, California Native American tribes, and that's a really big part, and the public. So some of the things that need to be in this plan that we're going to be developing are management actions necessary to conserve Western Joshua Tree, objective measurable criteria to assess the effectiveness of those actions, guidance for avoidance and minimization of impacts to Western Joshua Tree, the relocation guidelines, which I already mentioned. Kind of like the big portion in here is consulting with the Native American tribes. And then it specifically calls these out to include co-management principles, ensuring that traditional ecological knowledge is incorporated into the plan, and to provide for the relocation of Joshua trees on tribal lands if they request them. And so, yeah, we do have kind of a plan to do kind of one big informational meeting, but then we're going to be going around to each of the tribes and then consulting with them one by one in person. So stay tuned for that. All right, and so we kind of have like a really tight timeline that was written into the act. So kind of like the first thing in here is that the conservation plan needs to be done by December 31st, 2024. So we have only maybe 16 months to get this thing in. And I think there's an error on the slide, but so the second kind of update to the plan or annual reports that are submitted by CDFW to the Fish and Game Commission. The first one is due by January 31st, 2025. And so that's going to be going over, kind of how many permits we issued, how much land was conserved, how much land was developed, kind of a summary of all the actions that have happened up to January 31st, 2025. And then we're going to have to submit those annually. And so you can expect to see those annual reports and kind of see how we're doing here. Another kind of update to the plan is that in January 2026, the California Fish and Game Commission is going to review the status. So just like kind of look at the information that's in the annual reports and the plan to see if it's effective. And so at this time, we're also going to be making recommendations for amendments to the plan. And that's going to happen every 2 years after that point. So the conservation plan, it's going to be constantly evolving. It's going to be changing through time. So it's not going to be just kind of this one thing that's like set in stone once we get it in, because we only have 16 months to get it in. It will be constantly revised through time. And then I think Brendan alluded to this as well, but in December, so the end of 2026, CDFW is required to adopt and amend regulations to adjust the mitigation fee rates. And so that's to ensure that the conservation of the species is happening with the, with the price point, things like that. And so that is going to happen every 3 years on a 3-year basis after December 2026. And then kind of our last little timeline in here is that we are going to redo the status, or we're going to reissue a new Western Joshua Tree status review, which will be submitted to the California Fish and Game Commission. And they are required to reconsider the listing of the Western Joshua Tree. So no matter kind of what happens in between now and 10 years from now, the Fish and Game Commission is going to have to basically put that back on their docket and kind of look at all the annual reports, look at the conservation plans and effectiveness, and then make another determination. All right, and then you might be able to scan this one, but yeah, so this is the end of my talk. But yeah, we have a QR code up here, and it's to sign up for announcements that we're going to be kind of blasting out. And it's going to be like things like, oh, when the incidental take permits are ready, or when we enter into delegation agreements, or if there's like a comment review period. We're going to be sending these all through that one email announcement. So yeah, I'll just leave that up there for a little bit, and you can scan. And then also we have, if you haven't been there yet, but we have a Western Joshua Tree website, and it has more information on the act. It has the link to the hazard permits. It'll have the link to the incidental take permits once those are ready. Kind of be like the main hub for getting the information. All right, that's it. That's all I got.
All right, so thank you to all our speakers here. And we're about to go into our Q&A session. So if you need to get a drink of water, feel free to do so. But I'm going to go down here, and we're going to start our Q&As. And did we have, we had a question right there in the audience.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. It's really, really informative and very helpful. I'm wondering if there is a significant difference in the threats between the western and eastern species of Joshua tree that would cause us to be less worried about the eastern trees, and if not, what are our marching orders to get them protected too?
Yeah, I'll try. Is this working? Are you hearing me?
Yeah. Don't worry about the green.
Okay. I think Todd can answer the scientific question. But, when we think about the threats to Joshua trees, three categories: fire. Eastern species appears to, in some ways, be more vulnerable to fire. Western species clearly is, but the clumped distribution of like these big contiguous woodlands, if you get a fire, like York fire, Dome fire, you can have catastrophic loss of trees in that single fire. The more broken up distribution of the Western species means that it's less likely that so many trees will burn in a single incident, but we have had big fires. Fire. Climate, my intuitive thing is the Eastern species gets more of the summer monsoon, which I think helps, at least in the near term, mitigate the impacts of drought and heat stress, which is preventing recruitment of young trees. So I think they're near term slightly more resilient than Western Joshua trees. And then in California, at least, different question in Arizona and elsewhere, Western tree, 50% of it's on non-federal land, subject to development. The Eastern tree in California is almost exclusively on federal land. And so, and much of that is in the park system. So it's not facing the direct habitat threats. And habitat losses through development or other activities is the easiest thing to regulate. The climate threat, we got to solve that on a national, global scale in terms of emissions. We can do restoration activities and other things, head starting, whatever, to try to get trees through the very difficult decades ahead. But the easiest thing to regulate is don't kill them, or if you're going to kill them, minimize it and mitigate it. So yeah, I'm increasingly concerned over the Eastern species. I don't, it's harder to see an equivalent statute for the Eastern species because the whole premise on the Western species is regulating private land activity and development and utilizing the funds that flow from that to conservation activities throughout its range. You need a different regime for the Eastern.
So I don't significantly disagree with what Brendan said about the landscape threats in the East. We're seeing fire. We're seeing a lot of fire in the West too. So, and then the development in the West seems to be currently the thing that's going on. The next map that we made, which is happening right now, I'll be looking at tomorrow, is where we take all the threats that we discussed on top of where the refuges are hypothesized to be and where they are right now, and to overlay all that. So what we showed in those maps so far didn't show explicitly the development, the fires, the solar plants, and all that kind of thing. And so the answer's still out on that, but coming really soon. I may know tomorrow, but we'll share it as soon as we can. The climate is kind of interesting because you mentioned the monsoon, and this is not just for Joshua trees, but also Friday I saw a really detailed modeling effort on desert tortoises. And there are some similar parallels for this gradient across the desert of having more monsoons in the east. And both tortoises and Joshua trees respond to that. Recently, we've seen where little tortoises that we're studying have been growing in the summer instead of in the spring, with the summer monsoons coming and having the mega drought for the winter rains. So it flips it around. The tortoises aren't doing what the books say they do. And of course, that's exciting for scientists, but it also, to me, indicates resilience. And so I'm wondering if the same thing will be shown for the Eastern Joshua trees with an opportunity to grow, which we've done some experiments that show that the summer rains are better for germination and establishment of little Joshua trees than coming late in the year for sure. So if we get a late winter rain, the seeds will sprout, but then June comes and everything gets wiped out in June. Everything that's little gets wiped out in June. So they're really just annuals. And so the summer rains appear to be more important. And since because we get more summer rains in the eastern desert, maybe that offers more opportunity for natural climate window that's better for Joshua trees over there. But it's all hypothesis right now, and so it depends on what happens, and it's all about probabilities. So that makes it hard to answer that with much assurance.
Thank you. Oh, and we have a question up in the front here.
Yeah, a question about planting Joshua trees. Like, they're desirable in my first private property landscape. Are we, reading some of the language, it's not clear to me, may I plant a Joshua tree?
No, so under the act, it prohibits the possession of Western Joshua trees for either like sale or for private purposes. And so right now, yeah, the Western Joshua tree has protections that are very much like the California Endangered Species Act. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we love Joshua trees, we want more of them. There currently it's not like a mechanism for people to be able to have or possess them unless they had them before the act was initiated, before the candidacy period was initiated.
And I have a follow-up question to that. So as I understand it, we're not allowed to plant, even from our own seeds on our own property. I can't take a seed and plant it or water it or anything like that. That would be illegal.
No, you can. I mean, if you have Joshua trees on your property and they're like seeding, they can recruit naturally. But yeah,
I can't physically
we
plant.
aren't supposed to. Yeah, be like moving the seed.
And then,
I
there's
can maybe add some nuance to that one.
Yeah.
And not legal advice, but my understanding of the law. Anything possessed prior to October 9th, 2020, when it became protected, is exempt from certain prohibitions of the act. And so, 2019 was a really good year for flowers and seeds and whatnot. A lot of people stockpiled Joshua tree seeds, and we're probably approaching the end. Their viability dropped off after a few years. So, seeds possessed prior to that point, my understanding, talking to folks, and again, this is not legal advice, this is conversations with lawyers in the department, is, you can grow it, you can plant it. As soon as it's in the ground, you can't dig it out. It's not, it becomes fully protected at that stage. The bigger question, which I agree, it creates this conundrum of limiting affirmative conservation actions, is if we had local government buy-in, which we'd like to see, there's possibilities of permits or MOUs at a jurisdictional level that sort of set the parameters. So it would be a deal worked out with the department saying, part of minimizing and mitigating the impact from the take within the jurisdiction is, trees can be planted by people under conditions X, Y, and Z, and things of that sort. So there's mechanisms to do it. The big tension that led to this bill is conservation of a wide-ranging species like the tortoise or like the Western Joshua tree is easiest and most efficient when permitting occurs at the largest level, like the county level or Yucca Valley level, or something like that. And then you can cover all of these permutations in that larger permit. When local government refuses to play along, it's left by you as the individual to do it. You individually working up an MOU with the department to plant seeds is not realistic. So finding that middle ground, and we talked about things that entities like MDLT working out arrangements with the department with sort of delegated authority where it can oversee such things. So my hope, long way of saying, it's one of those side effects of making a law that's as protective as CISA and has the same prohibitions. Ultimately, I believe that flexibility will be there, but it will take a little while and it'll be a big subject of conservation.
just a quick follow-up. So the Mojave National Preserve, I do some volunteer work there. We're planting Joshua trees. Is that in danger? Is that going to go forward, that effort to replant?
Yeah.
Wildfire, or?
So the trees in Mojave National Preserve are the eastern Joshua trees, which are not covered under this act. Also, that it's federal land and it's federal activities, and so the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act only applies to non-federal lands. And so, yeah, they are able to continue to go on, and I hope that you do. You plant many Joshua trees.
Non-federal activity.
Yeah.
Just slightly different. So yes, Joshua Tree National Park can do whatever it wants with its Western Joshua trees without regard to state permits. It has to comply with federal law, obviously, but and then BLM could do things with Joshua trees on BLM land. It does apply to non-federal actors on federal lands. So for example, one example of this entity built a solar project on Edwards Air Force Base. It wasn't Edwards building it for themselves. It was them making their land available to a solar company to build the project. That company had to get both permits from the feds to build it, as well as state permits for the take of trees. So the law does have some protections on federal land, but federal land managers can do and should be doing everything possible to recover the species without the need for permits.
And then I saw 4 different hands, so we're going to kind of go this direction here. So we'll first go with you there.
When I read the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act originally when it first came out, there was a little small section in there that said when the trees get transplanted, you don't have to have a watering program.
So I just want to address that issue. Will they be watered if they're transplanted?
So I think there was maybe some difference in the original language that was proposed in February 2023, and then the final language that was proposed, or that was passed in July. But I think one of the things that was added was that permittees who get an incidental take permit to take a tree, if they're required to relocate it, they have to look after that tree and do the best that they can to ensure that it survives. And so these are kind of maybe some of the avoidance minimization conditions that are going to be also included in the incidental take permits. And so that is there.
To this gentleman's question, to tack that onto a point there, or a question, why is it that it's so stringent for a private party on my own land to not be able to plant Joshua tree seeds? I mean, I understand, okay, there's a law, yada, 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 but as a layman, to me, that doesn't make absolutely no sense. And I'd like to know what the scientific reason is behind it. I get asked that a lot of times, and I don't have a clue. So, what should I tell people?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of difficult.
Want me to?
Yeah,
So partly, it's there's a tension that's been existing throughout this process. The Joshua tree meets the legal definitions, I believe, for listing as a threatened species. It's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future and would be protected under CISA. It's also different than every other endangered plant, in that there's a lot of them in a lot of places. And so there's this, you make a law that sets different protections for Joshua trees than you have for other plants. So think most listed plants, the origin of the California Desert Native Plants Act, the original protection of Joshua Tree National Park came out in an era of cactus poaching, where in the 1930s, the biggest concern for conservation of desert plants was actually the commercial trade in them. And so endangered species laws regulate the possession and sale and transfer. And so that applies. I agree for Joshua trees, there's affirmative things people can do, but the same way for, say an endangered frog, many people are like, well, I'd love to breed one in my aquarium, yet there's restrictions on that because of the trade in wildlife. And so I agree Joshua trees are not threatened by trade, but they exist in a legal regime where that applies.
So in other words, what I just heard, just to be clear, I'm not trying to be argumentative or anything, but I cannot, or a person cannot plant Joshua tree seeds on their own private land due to the fact that some body, okay, is worried that all of a sudden we're gonna open it up to, I don't know, trade to having Joshua tree farms. That's what I'm hearing. And is there, I mean, are we worried that, to me, I was like, well, gosh, maybe if I start planting it in my own backyard, it's gonna affect the DNA or the mitochondria or some biological thing, that it's gonna be, I'm gonna create a different species over time. It's not natural. But now I'm hearing it's just that you're afraid that people are gonna, it's gonna become commercial. And in which case, what would be wrong with that? You know, my God, if I could go down and go down to the cactus farm and buy Joshua trees to plant in my yard, wouldn't that be a bonus? Would that or would that not be a bonus?
Again, not even, like, there's a legal regime and then there's the practical things. And one of the things that's being researched is the genetics of Joshua trees. We have 2 species. Most Joshua tree seeds that you can buy at a nursery are an eastern species. Most ornamental trees, even planted in the range of the western tree, are the eastern species. We want to, if we're going to ensure the survival of the tree, ensure the survival of the moth, make sure that the planting we do on a conservation level is of trees from the right species. Ideally, there's all this genetics studies being done of which ones are most resilient to climate, which ones are most likely to survive. And you know, my hope, like, there's been a lot of sort of inconvenience as a result of interim protections that all could be resolved with region-wide permitting, local buy-in of government jurisdictions. My hope is the conservation plan is going to set out those kind of broad things of this is when and where planting can occur and things of that sort. But until then, yes, that, you know, unless you have the seeds before or the plants before they were protected, and for the moment, you can't without getting a permit. You can always apply.
Just wondering if you're able to share when you think you might have the permitting scheme published and ready?
For the incidental, so the hazard management permits are ready. Incidental take permits are very close. We're just finalizing some of the guidance and making sure that we have like kind of like the legal room to kind of issue this guidance. And so I can't say when, but very soon, and we're working as soon as possible.
Hi, yes, I actually have a case in one of my houses that one Joshua tree fell down in a way, blocking the driveway to get to the place. And my concern is I'm trying to save it first, but it's a huge. This is like maybe 20 feet, 20-some feet. And it's not a straight one, the top heavy, and the top heavy is leaning toward the east. And so I wanted to get some kind of a clue how to, keep this Joshua tree alive, because I'm in the process of through the things to get maybe cutting it down, but I really don't want to cut it, and it's already off the root in the ground, and we're rather trying to keep it up, but it's huge. I don't know how to do that. So if any suggestion on that?
Yeah, because like the hazard management permits are to like kind of trim and remove, but you probably have like a desert native plant specialist come there and maybe like trim some of the limbs, so it's maybe like a little more balance, and then right side the tree back up, and then the desert native plant specialist could do that. But would probably have to go through that hazard management permit system. When he says blocking your driveway, so you want to write it back up to remove the hazard of the tree, and you're going to have a desert native plant specialist help you kind of save that tree.
I was hoping somebody will be here to be able to tell me about it, but if there is a Joshua tree that's going to the east side, facing east falling down in the driveway, is it in the same spot? And I moved this and put it to the other side, to the west side, because the west side is a room to be able, so the root stays in the same position, but 180 degrees. I know you're not going to change those things because they are supposed to be, like I said, north and south. oriented for the Joshua trees, but I was wondering if that is possible, or again, I have to talk to them. I'm in the middle of getting a permit for that possibility of cutting it down. I really don't want to do it. I'd rather keep it safe. So, anybody knows anything, please get a hold of me.
Yeah, I mean, like, the orientation of the tree can help those trees survive, and it's been kind of, I don't know if it's been documented by Joshua Tree specifically, but like other plants, I know that a lot of restoration specialists, they do mark the side of the tree that is the north side, and they make sure that it's pointing north. But that is only to just like boost the survivorship of it. It might do just fine if you mentioned that it's shaded on one side of the house, and you're going to move it to the other side of the house, where it's going to get shaded at a different time of day.
No, it's just going to be the same spot. It's just 180-degree turn around in the same position when you fall out. And I have to dig into it and root it up and put more soil in it. I don't mind it being on the ground the way it is. It might grow back up, which I've seen a lot of them do so. I just don't want it to cut it down. I mean, it just makes it beautiful.
Yeah, so I would work with the designated plant specialist with that, and then they can make recommendations. And like I said, like the orientation, it's not going to be like necessarily like a strict like, oh, it has to be facing the same direction, but we're going to develop those guidelines as we go. But for your problem right now, there are a lot of people out there that do transplanting, relocation. They have before the act and stuff, and so they have a lot of knowledge with them, and so they can help you to the best of their ability.
So I have a question. Can you hear me? Okay. Several questions. One observation though, on the growing of them, how about 6 per person? That's a good number to go with. So anyway, now the real question, well, several questions. One is, being that spading is 6 to 8 times more effective in the success of a tree being relocated, is that going to be a requirement for anything over, say, about 2 meters? Or maybe 3 meters?
Well, yeah, we can't say what the guidelines are right now, and but yeah, I know that we do have the ability to require relocation, and so yeah, we're still working through the guidelines. So the guidelines are one thing. So guidelines for when trees need to be relocated and how many and what size, and then the protocol for that as well, like the gentleman was talking about orientation, kind of how it's done and stuff.
Okay, well, I've been out here at least 30 years, and I've been watching Yucca Valley for many years, and I've heard bitching and moaning from Yucca Valley regarding what the cost is for a certified surveyor for Joshua trees, and or what would it cost to move them. My concern would be, I know that initially supply and demand is going to make it so that they can, I've heard them say $1,500 for a tree survey situation, and so I don't know if your group or your agency is going to regulate what the maximum can be charged for the survey efforts.
Yeah, I don't think the act allows us to kind of regulate the open market.
Yeah.
Would the city be able to?
The city could set a cap on it or set requirements or have a city employee who does it. There's all sorts of ways, a cooperative local government could make this as easy as possible for its residents.
Well,
that's one of the political.
That's segues to my third question. My third question would be, I'm a good friend of Christina Sanchez, and she probably told you about her event August 10th, 2020, where she got her 6-minute recording of the Yucca Valley saying what they actually do to give permits after the fact. In other words, if a Joshua tree is destroyed, they'll give a permit after that. They admitted it on audio. My question is, can you trust these towns and or counties to enforce what you want them to enforce?
Given Drew, both my colleagues here are government employees and have a little less, perhaps, license to say exactly what they want to say. So the reason we have the act is because the state didn't trust local governments alone to manage Joshua trees. You know, it's an affirmative taking that authority away, giving it to the state, and then saying, you want it back, you got to do all these things, you got to do all these reporting, you got to do all of these monitoring. We're going to review it and make sure you're actually going to do it. When the authority was delegated during candidacy for a year or so to Yucca Valley, you know, my sense is that was a much better functional regime than we had before. You know, undoubtedly, they had problems. So, so there is that sense of we need them. We want their participation. We want them to do right by the tree and by the communities. But there's enough oversight that I think, you know, if they don't, then delegated authority will get taken away, and you know, people will have to get separate permits from the state. Right now, the idea was to make it easier for people that when you get your building permit from Yucca Valley or the county, you can also get your Joshua Tree take permit at the same time. But that requires, you know, the local governments doing right by it. On your question of can they require tree spades, things of that sort, the conservation plan will include protocols. You know, the department can't say exactly what those will contain now. That's all pre-decisional. But folks like yourself and others with expertise should write comments to the department. There's going to be public process on the conservation plan. There'll be public hearings in front of the Fish and Game Commission as well. And do everything you can to ensure that all elements of this law as it's rolled out are, you know, most protective and also sensible and functional and practicable, so that we can make it, you know, as easy as possible for people who want to do right by the tree, and as hard as possible for those who would mow them down wholesale without consideration. There's plenty of opportunity to apply your knowledge and tenacity to that.
Oh, thank you. And we're going to have a question here and a question in the back, and then we're going to see where we are at that point with timing.
I'm trying to gain an understanding of the overall protection of the Joshua Tree, where this act applies to single-family homes and public works projects. And in trying to get background information on it, I saw that there were 15 solar farms that were approved, which would seem to be outside of this act. And I'm just wondering how that coordinates. How are those exactly approved? And it seems like there's unlimited take for those solar farms. So how is that brought into the whole protection idea?
So there's a slide up there that I showed you, and there are some different kind of permits that people can obtain. And so the California Endangered Species Act permits are still valid, and they still will be. And so those projects probably obtained a California Endangered Species Act permit, which has separate mitigations. They're a little bit more stringent than the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act about, you know, fully mitigating, which, you know, might require that, you know, they buy more land and conserve more Joshua trees than they're removing. And so that's all. Those projects are probably already approved to get take of Western Joshua trees through the California Endangered Species Act, not through the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act.
Right. My concern is that with this single-family homes and public works project, the number of trees saved by this act, how is that relative to the number of trees that are going to be destroyed by the 15 solar farms that were approved? Is it comparable at all, or?
Well, I mean, like, it's a per tree basis, and then each tree is a stem. And so if you're talking about all these different stems of the Joshua trees, you know, those can add up, and then, you know, we can use those fees and those in the conservation fund to do like meaningful, you know, acquisition of, you know, places like Todd's map showed where all those refugia are going to be. Like, we can target those areas, you know, and make sure that we're conserving them and looking at a landscape scale when we're, you know, purchasing land. And so, yeah. So
Another way of answering the question: take is prohibited for absent some form of permit or authorization. for every entity taking a tree, whether it's one tree, 10,000 trees. There's also the requirement that's before any permit is issued, for when it's incidental, separate from the hazard trees, avoid and then minimize. Both of those are caveated with to maximum extent practical, and then mitigate. So, previously, the solar projects were authorized during candidacy by a special regulation. The solar project was like, it's not practicable to relocate them. There's no red tape them. There's too many of them. And the department was like, okay. I think that we want to change that so that it is practicable to relocate a tree, or you have to argue better that you're avoiding them. The whole thing about the local jurisdiction limits, that's for delegated authority. So anyone can apply for a permit to the state for one tree or 1,000 trees, whether it's a giant housing development or a hot tub in your backyard. But to make that permitting simpler, the idea is local jurisdictions can get limited authority to issue permits themselves. But those permits are, because again, the point, can we trust the local governments? Those have caps. No more than 10 trees for a small project, no more than 40 for a local public works project. For projects that take much more, they have to go through the department. And those also have large CEQA processes and public processes. But ultimately, endangered species laws, contrary to popular belief, they don't outright prohibit actions that kill or remove protected species. They require permits, and those permits all have that same avoid, minimize, mitigate, and that applies regardless. And the other thing about mitigation, and this is sort of one of the kind of unspoken things about how it works. A permit fee serves sort of two purposes. One, if a tree is viewed as valuable, or put it from the opposite perspective, costly, that itself is a deterrent from bulldozing it. It's like, can I work around and avoid having to pay a permit fee for that tree? That's the avoidance part. So the higher the fee, the more seriously people take that interest. The other is the higher the fee, the more mitigation dollars are put into the fund, which then can fund these hopefully landscape level things. So, all of that is playing out, but we also, as you've heard from people here, Joshua tree is unique. We're not talking about a rare plant that occurs in one spot, and the loss of that one little population dooms the species to extinction. We have a lot of Joshua trees on the landscape, many in places that the climate models show are not going to be suitable habitat, 40 years from now. How do we use development permits for those to fund a broader conservation scheme that can protect the species in the best possible places long term?
And will larger or large-scale solar projects in the future be approved under the present permitting mechanism?
Yeah, probably, since they will have to apply for it and do all of those, comply with every provision.
And is there any ideas to maybe the number that would be taken through that process versus through the Conservation Act? Is there any back of the envelope idea of what that would be?
Are you talking about like getting CISA permits versus Conservation Act?
Right, exactly. And with the Conservation Act, because of its relatively small scale, be nothing compared to large solar farms being approved.
Sorry, I don't understand your question. So, well, one, I don't think like the act is small scale because considering the entire range of the species, it's looking, doing meaningful action to conserve it, restore lands, and then as far as like, would they get like a CISA permit as opposed to an incidental take permit?
Right, I mean, where there's 10 trees or 40 trees under the Conservation Act versus the CISA permit, which seems to be unlimited as far as the take.
I think what's part of the confusion is during candidacy, a special regulation was passed to provide a quick take mechanism for 15 shovel-ready solar projects that said, these projects already have contracts, we already have things, start dates. If we have to apply for a normal permit through the normal process, it'll take forever. We'll violate the terms of our electric power delivery, plus they're already financed. Give us a quick way of doing it to tell us how much it is. So that those projects went through their own special thing. That's sort of a done deal. There's the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act covers all activities across the desert, whether it's solar project or a hot tub. It's this, but, and as I said before, those overall frameworks apply. Now the department can say, no, your project, you're not avoiding trees, that it's practicable to build it elsewhere, or to build it in a different configuration where you kill a lot more fewer trees. They can say, thanks to the work of land trusts that have identified areas where we can relocate trees, it's practicable to relocate all these trees. We're going to make you do that. If you have to do that, that's extra cost. Maybe you'll decide, I'm not going to build it here, I'm going to build it there. So the hope, there's two things that are in tension with themselves that played out in this bill, and the politics of it is California wants to and needs to put in a whole lot more solar capacity. I think virtually everyone in this room wants it to be on rooftops and parking lots and everywhere else. Some of it's going to be large scale projects. And some of those that are already in the pipeline are going to be in these like fragmented remnants of woodland in the Antelope Valley. Ideally, if you apply the fee schedule and things to that, projects will take that into calculation and be like, all right, it used to be cheaper to build on a Joshua Tree woodland because there was no mitigation requirement, but I had to mitigate for farmland. So this burnt out grazing land or abandoned farmland was actually more expensive to build. With this act and the processes in it, that economic balance shifts a bit. And so hopefully it'll start steering these projects away from that. And if the project is truly on a large scale where we can say, this is in a key conservation area identified as a refugium, it's taking way too many trees, the department can simply say, no. The permit law, the law says the department may issue a permit. Nowhere does it say they shall issue a permit.
And then we have and then we have one more question back here.
Yes, my question has to do with the hazardous management permits. And I really admire all the work responding to the Conservation Act and trying to protect the Joshua Tree behind that. But it seems like some of the requirements just aren't practical, so what's the point? And the example that I was thinking of, and because I have a similar experience, a person has a Joshua Tree within 30 feet of the house that's a hazard because it's going to fall on the house or some limbs of it. And so, normally in the past, people would go out and trim it themselves. I mean, they have the common sense to know they have to protect their house or for a huge tree like the one I had, hire some local landscaping yard work kind of a company. But now if the same homeowner gets through the permitting process to get a permit to remove the hazard to their house, then they have to call in a certified natural plant specialist. A couple of my questions are, how many certified natural plant specialists are there in California? Are there any possibly in the Morongo Basin, this area? And then I assume there's a limited number of these people, so they could charge you a lot to trim your tree. There's no, they could ask anything. And so then you can't afford to trim the tree, it falls on your house. The state of California doesn't owe you anything. You can't repair your house roughly. That's my question.
So I think I heard, where can I find a designated plant specialist? So under the Act, yeah, it's a certified arborist, and certified arborists can be found on the ISA, so the International Society of Arboriculture's website. They do have a database of all certified arborists on there. So you can go onto their website, search for an arborist in your local area, and then you can get their contact information like that. The second part about the designated plant specialist is that can be someone with at least 5 years professional experience relocating or restoring, California native vegetation. And so people who've done restoration are, usually maybe found in consulting, like environmental consulting companies. They could be people who have, I don't know, maybe worked at Joshua Tree for 5 years in the vegetation program. And then like people who've done relocation, a lot of, like you mentioned, landscaping companies have folks, especially in areas with Joshua trees or cacti and things like that, that have done relocation for more than 5 years. And so, yeah, we're in the process of releasing some frequently asked questions. We're getting all the questions vetted, but that's one of them. Like, where can I find a designated plant specialist?
Oh, and thank you for that. And also on the Mojave Desert Land Trust website, we do have some information, a list. We don't give any recommendations, but we have resources on our website for some of these items as well. And I think we do have we do have some questions in the audience. I think we're going to try to wrap up. I don't know if you had a really quick. Did you have a quick follow up?
Hi, so first, is there anything in the act that prevents the developer from just paying a fine to take the Joshua trees? I mean, is there anything different in the act that offers any kind of protection versus, I guess, what was before, or any protection at all?
It's protected by state law under the Fish and Game Code. Removal of a Joshua tree without a permit or authorization is a felony.
Well, no, but I'm talking about the incidental take.
Okay, a permit.
They can just pay for it. They can just pay for it. Cost of doing business.
It's all permitting is that way and always has been under endangered species laws. Here, that's a specific one. So, yeah, the department can always say no if the permit is not meeting the conditions. But in general, if again, they have to say, demonstrate. Here's how I avoided as many trees as possible. Why, and that's the department can say, why did you want to put it? Why did you put the porch there when there's empty space there? You could design around the Joshua tree. We're not going to give you a permit. You have to. They can say, here's how I minimized it. I'm going to relocate it. The department can say, if you're going to remove it, you got to relocate it in your yard. Your yard's big enough. Put it elsewhere in the yard. So the department has lots of authority to say all those things, and hopefully they'll standardize these protocols and do things that will, make sense, that'll be protected, will prevent sort of like, tree removal or tree killing that, is common sense, that didn't need to happen, but won't stop things that people living in the desert know are, here's a common occurrence. This branch is leaning towards my house. How do I deal with that? Well, there's a free permit you can get, so it'll probably there'll be some rocky things, it's been protected for the past 3 years or 2.5 years. And, the desert's still seen a building boom, property values, housing values have doubled in this area, so it's not like this is the end of the world. In fact, it's a permitting scheme that's, more specifically tailored to the realities of things, but it's obviously, there's always an outlier, and it's Drew's job to figure those out.
And how effective is the transplanting? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, transplanting Joshua trees, it's not that hard to do, surprisingly.
Or success rate, I should say.
Success rate. If you do it right, I know companies out there, working on 138, they got 90-95% success rate with their relocating their Joshua trees. So, and then maybe I can kind of hit on your question and the question of the person behind you. But Yeah, so Brendan mentioned that we, on top of the fee, we are going to have these avoidance and minimization standard conditions that are tied to the permit. So yeah, they're going to maybe do something with the tree, but we're going to tell them everything that they need to do in order to minimize that. And so maybe that is maybe you just trim the tree, or maybe you relocate it, and then the person behind you who would like to have more Joshua trees on their property, one of the permitting, or one of the permitting methods, or things in there was safe harbor agreements. And so the act specifically calls that out, that any person who accepts a relocated Joshua tree on their property will not be fined or responsible for the upkeep of that, but the permittee will be up to a certain extent. So if you want more Joshua trees, we might be setting up these ways for people to accept more Joshua trees on their property. That way we're not just killing as many.
I'll go really quick. One of my next door neighbors about a year and a half ago cut down 5 beautiful Joshua trees in his backyard after it was protected, okay, and just tossed them over the fence. So I called the CFW warden, and he said it wasn't really his area. He didn't really know that much about Joshua trees. So could you guys make sure you train your local wardens about Joshua trees? Because you didn't even go over and talk to them or anything.
They're aware. If you there's a hotline called CalTIP, and it's run by CDFW, and call that, and then the law enforcement division will is required to look into those.
I'm just saying, maybe it's better now.
My understanding, there was a lot of frustration, and I shared it at phone calls that go into the void of, hey, there's something illegal happening, and you don't get a response. Now that this is law, the department is staffed up. They have on their website a point person in the wardens who does know it. They're doing trainings and all of those things. So hopefully we will see. The department put a whole lot of effort into this bill and wants it to succeed, and they recognize that enforcement is necessary. Obviously, we need to collectively hold them to that, call them and report things, and if they don't, if you don't get a response, go to the webpage, call Drew, and say, hey, you're the coordinator, tell the wardens we've got complaints. There's more of a system now than there was over the past 3 years. And so hopefully that'll be addressed. And, if it's an unpermitted thing, the statute of limitations is several years, so re-up your phone call to the warden.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that we have this community forum is to invite, government agency representatives, and, we can kind of look at this dialogue and get some of these questions answered, but also kind of get this face-to-face through this process. We're going to start wrapping up. I have Kelly Flint here, who's in our philanthropy department. She's going to say a few words, and then I'm going to start with the closing.
All right, everyone, I'll keep this really brief. I'm Kelly Flint. Like Sarah said, I represent the philanthropy department here at MDLT, and I'm excited to share that this month, as many of you know, we're celebrating 17 years as an organization, and we rely on support from our community to do our work to protect the California desert and host events like this one. We have donation QR codes sprinkled around the building tonight, and for those of you watching from afar, please visit mdlt.org/donate. And if you would like to donate in another way or have questions about supporting our work, feel free to come see me. Thank you so much in advance.
All right, so I know we'll probably have, more questions, coming in, and I know that the agencies will as well. So, we'll be on the lookout. We want to thank our speakers, Brendan Cummings, Todd Esque, and Drew Kaiser for coming here today. Thank our volunteers and staff who kind of helped put this event together. And we want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Thank you, and you have great questions, great follow-ups. We look forward to learning more throughout this process and hope you all have a great evening.
Perfect.